Well, we've got a real treat today on the show. It's one of my favourite things when we get expert partners to come in and be in person with us on the show. And Amy, you joined us all the way from Seattle, is that right?
Yes, Seattle to New York to London.
There we go.
Happy to be here.
And we're going to claim it's just to see me and Mark in the studio.
Oh, absolutely. 100%.
Yeah, no
Wouldn't
customer
miss it.
meetings,
Nope.
no, yeah, okay, yeah, so we'll take the credit for this one. No, really appreciate it. And really this is off the back of some fantastic work that Altana and Moody's do together. And it's about a really serious topic though, so I should probably take the smile down my face because I love these conversations, but it's Human Awareness Month, and it's a topic we've covered in 2022, again in 24, we did a couple episodes in January 25 on this, where we try to expose the topic to as many people as possible and different elements of it that people should be thinking about so they can play their role. Because I don't think everyone fully knows or feels the fact that modern slavery, as it's referred to, sometimes forced labour, is happening almost now more than ever. We sometimes think of slavery as something in the past, but it is very much present. And Altana is actually one of the companies that's doing some very clever things to help companies prevent that, or at least to detect it. So Amy, before we jump into some of that clever stuff, there will be people that haven't listened to those 4 or 5 episodes we've done in the past that we'll link in the show notes for them. When we think about forced labour, how do you define that for someone who's maybe new to the topic?
Right. So a lot of people talk about modern slavery, forced labor, trafficking, things like that. The way I talk about it to folks who aren't familiar with the topic is somewhere in the production of a thing, a physical good, maybe at the tier 1, likely at the tier 2, tier 3 level, there's the potential for that product to have been manufactured using some nefarious activity, using forced labor, using modern slavery to produce those goods. Unbeknownst to the consumer, and sometimes unbeknownst to the tier 1, that's the case. And that's just a byproduct of the globalization, the increase in globalization that has occurred since the post-World War II era. And it's unfortunate, but that's how I describe what it is. What's exciting is how we're working using latest technologies, using artificial intelligence to help identify so companies can make better choices. So once they're aware that exposure or that potential exists, they can take action to remedy it.
Yeah, I mean, it'll sound like a AA meeting or something, but until you acknowledge the problem, you're not gonna solve it, right? And
well, most companies wouldn't know that it exists. I mean, I would hope that most companies, if they knew that forced labor existed somewhere in their supply chain, that they would do something about it. And the thing that motivates me every day is knowing that if I can put better information in the hands of these companies, that they would truly make better decisions. So once they know, they can take action.
Yeah. So what I normally do on almost every topic that we cover on this show is I'll say, okay, what is this thing? And then why does it matter? But on this one, it's kind of a pointless, why does this matter? Is people shouldn't be forced to do anything that they don't want to do, right? And particularly not in a world where we think of slavery as something in the past. No, that shouldn't exist today. We've got regulations against it in most of the modern, countries and democracies in the world. So we have some of the legal piece covered. We have some of the regulation, but as you say, if someone can't see it, they might not realize they're right. Somehow involved. So yeah, the why is kind of irrelevant, but the how this occurs, I suppose, is more interesting to try and understand for the audience today. And how is this being allowed to continue? How is this hiding in these value chains? So could you maybe talk a bit about the challenges for companies when they're trying to detect this?
Absolutely. You covered a lot of territory there. You talked about there's the moral issue, there's a moral dilemma. But yes, we are in a moment where there are regulations now. So even if it wasn't the moral reason to resolve the forced labor issue, we're in a moment where there are regulations that are going into effect around the world. The United States, the EU, Australia, Canada, all have regulations banning the import of goods that were manufactured with forced labor. So it's a great way to set the context. And the big challenge most companies have is that forced labor risk hides, but it hides really in plain sight. So sort of what I was saying before about how most companies know who their direct suppliers are. They know who they buy products from. The real risk often lives deeper beyond that tier 1 into the tier 2, 3, 4, even beyond, right? It's not usually the supplier that manufactures the product. It's likely the workers on the farm that harvested the fibers or mined the metals that went into making the intermediate goods that then go into the finished product, right? So that's the big challenge. Now, in addition to that challenge, if companies do know about who those outer tier suppliers are, it usually lives in a spreadsheet or an email. It doesn't live in a system somewhere that allows companies to connect the dots to tie that exposure back to them or back to their product. So it makes it difficult to even understand how that forced labor risk may impact their business. And I'll also mention here that this is happening not just in relation to forced labor. I know we're talking about forced labor today, and we'll get into more of that. But these same blind spots are actually hiding, carbon footprints or deforestation potential or even tariff exposure, since tariffs are a really hot topic right now. So these outer tier shadows are where some of these risk exposure opportunities live, and forced labor is certainly one of them.
And interestingly, some of those points you made, those other risks coalesce with forced labor. On some of those previous episodes I mentioned, they talk about deforestation camps often run with people that have been trafficked and enslaved and are now doing this. And there's some really clever stuff where we've had people talk about how you can use satellite imagery and you can pick up, there's emissions there that shouldn't be because there's no registered deforestation going on there. So like someone should go check that out. But this is quite cutting edge stuff and is not necessarily in the sort of 101 supplier management handbook as it has been developed. No. But would it be fair, you've talked there about the chain, a tier 1 supplier who you know, and then they've got their supplier and that supplier's got their supplier. So that value chain, I believe is the phrase I've learned from colleagues at Altana. Is that why it's more complicated today than maybe it was 20, 30, 40 years ago to understand where the risk is in your value chain?
I think a couple of things, right? First of all, until recently, although forced labor has been illegal in the United States going back to the 30s, technically, it wasn't something that ever crossed my desk as a trade professional. So let's just say companies didn't have to look beyond their tier 1. There was no reason for them to look beyond their tier 1. They didn't have to. No regulatory purpose. There was the occasional edge case where they might be engaging in a free trade program or something that would require it. But when it comes to forced labor, it wasn't something that they were looking for. So first of all, they weren't capturing that information. The second issue then is that the traditional methods for collecting that information would be like sending a questionnaire or a survey out to your suppliers and hoping that they respond back honestly with who their suppliers are and whether or not those suppliers are engaged in any sort of trafficking or forced labor situation. So I think those are the major issues. And one of the amazing things that AI is enabling us to do is really just connect the dots of our data so that we can see the things that we couldn't see before, whether or not we were looking for them.
Okay, so the chains may have grown more with globalization and the complex nature of today's products in some areas, but really it's that previously this was all relying on individual leaders having an ethical mindset and going, I'm going to go look for trouble, which is they're not incentivized to do, but it would need to be a personal crusade or education or awareness that was embedded. And then even then, you're relying on those that lead your suppliers and their suppliers to all have the same morals, same ethics, same level of honesty, transparency. So it's almost a fool's errand at that point because you can't trust the process, I would guess, if you're doing it that way.
Well, you want to trust the process, but ignorance is no longer a strategy, something that you can rely on if you were to get your products detained or if you were to be questioned about your compliance with these regulations. You can't claim that you just didn't know. And if your supplier if they omit information, then how do you trust that information, right?
And plausible deniability.
That's exactly
that's
it.
Not the point
That's
anymore.
not the point. And it's no longer acceptable. So the other thing you said is that the supply chains, or the value chains rather, have sprawled over the last 30 years. So take that traditional process and then just multiply it by, magnitudes, how all the different subcontractors and suppliers that are involved now in the manufacture of our goods gets very unwieldy.
Absolutely. Do you, and as you said, you're a trade professional before you ever became a technologist. Do you have some anecdotes perhaps where companies thought they were doing the right thing, but then they've applied more modern techniques and then they've sort of discovered, risks in the tier 2 and beyond suppliers? So it'd be interesting to bring that to life a little.
Absolutely. I've got countless examples of this scenario playing out, because really companies who desire to see beyond their tier 1 is the reason a lot of them come to Altana in the first place. That's what we enable them to do, is use our product network to illuminate their multi-tier chains. But a couple of anecdotes. For example, there is a well-known apparel brand thought for sure that their cotton value chain was completely free and clear of any forced labor risk. But when they used Altana to illuminate their value chains for some key products, they traced some of their cotton back to a fiber mill out at the tier 3 level that was connected to an intermediary in Xinjiang, China. So that was one case where we were able to help them identify something that they couldn't see or didn't see before. There's another case where it's an electronics manufacturer. They used Altana to map their copper and their aluminum supply chain. And that visibility revealed some exposures to high-risk smelters that were several tiers upstream that they didn't even know existed in the first place. So including one copper source that was linked to a sanctioned entity, so not even necessarily forced labor, but to a sanctioned party. So this happens all the time. There's many, many stories like this. Those are just a couple examples. But I would say here that visibility like this isn't just about compliance now. We're talking about resilience. If you find it, what is the impact to that product supply chain, and then thus its impact on your business or your customer's business, et cetera.
What do these companies, or do you recall what these companies then did? Is it you found the information and you solve it in a few days and it's everyone in and we're going to solve this, or is it a sort of slower transformation? I'm curious to that practicality after the discovery.
Yeah, great question, right? So it really varies on what the company's, their tolerance, their policy, their desire. So some companies use this information and they use it to, rather than issue a questionnaire to their suppliers, they actually share the information, share the insights with the suppliers. Says, hey, this is what I see. Can you validate that this supplier is actually involved in the manufacture of my products? Can you help me look into this? And then they can validate whether or not it's true, or if it's a false positive, and we can clear that from their value chain. Some will have a zero tolerance policy, and they might seek alternative suppliers. So they will work with their tier 1 and say, I see some potential exposures out here at my tier 2 or tier 3. Can we work together to find an alternative? So it really depends on what the company's motivations are, or what their goals are, what their threshold or policies are.
So I suppose in that first scenario, it's kind of a coalition of the willing, like you go and try and collaborate and hope those people have the same values as you. Hopefully they do if you've picked your suppliers carefully at the tier 1 level. Whereas the other is a little bit more stick, I guess, which is this is the standard we expect. And if you don't abide by our standard, we'll take our business elsewhere, which increases either attrition to the tier 1 or increases their cost if they say, well, you're now going to have to go rectify this and this is what we expect. It's unplanned work, unplanned expenditure to go and that tier 1 to go change their process. Right.
I mean, you touched on something really important. I mean, another option is they could work with their supplier to remediate the issue altogether. How can we work together to eliminate this risk from your chain? Yes, you might say it causes some additional work, but I would actually reply with, it saves you work on the back end, right? It reduces the potential for your products to have issues at the border when there's so many reasons for issues to have at the border these days. let's eliminate one more. And if you do get questioned, there's all this scrambling and all of this running around that folks have to do to collect documents in order to support, to negate, or validate their positions later. So you're actually saving yourself work and risk by doing that work upstream.
Good. And you mentioned in the first example, Xinjiang, China. And for those that are uninformed, that's all around hopefully get the acronym right, the UFLPA.
Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in the US, yes.
There we go. I read it off the screen very well. I couldn't actually quite get it right. It's too many letters. I need like 3 letters or less. So that's one of the core regulations I often see called out. How are you seeing those regulations? How are they making their impact? So, what have you seen change over, your time in this space?
Yeah, so in the last several years since the UFLPA went into effect, I think we're in year 3 now. Couple things. You've seen a lot of companies change their behavior. They're paying attention to things that they didn't pay attention before. We've moved from awareness to actually taking action. So where companies didn't even know that they needed to be looking at these things, not only are they looking at them, but they're actually taking action. So as a result, you see maybe less enforcement. You see governments moving on to enforce other things. But you also see companies paying very close attention. It's now ingrained in their policies. It's not just something that we did for a while and then it's going away. It's something that we have a process for forced labor now. We look for it. We remediate the risks. And this is just something we do now. It's part of our business. So that's been really exciting. I have been watching the numbers on the enforcements that the U.S. CBP, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, what they do on a month-to-month basis. And the numbers do fluctuate. It's interesting to watch the industries fluctuate, what enforcement, where they're focusing their enforcement efforts now. Maybe they'll switch from apparel and textiles to agriculture to other things. So it's very interesting to watch how this space has evolved and will continue to evolve, especially as we see more ESG, more environmental and social regulations get folded into that mix.
Okay. And those industries you mentioned there, are those the 3 that do come up the most? Or what have you seen in maybe the past 12 months or so in terms of where these enforcement agencies are focused? So
definitely still in the apparel space, cotton being one of those huge spaces. But solar panels, you see governments looking at like steel and aluminum metals, automobile parts, things like that. I haven't seen too many of our customers impacted by the agriculture, but I know it's out there. So it's definitely a varied mix.
Okay. And there's obviously companies of different sizes, right? That in all value chains, there's companies that are going to have an entire compliance department as well as a supply chain, group and even, a separate procurement team. And there's others where it might be one person. And there's others where they're so small that it's just the business owners kind of having to figure this out. How are they? Well, so I suppose the better question is, what do they need to know, particularly on the smaller side, to manage compliance?
What do they need to know?
Because I think that's often the thing, right? Like you can get lost in a regulation, the way they're often worded, and there's a million comment pieces. But like, I always try to think that I'm someone with a working knowledge of a number of things, but not huge amounts of depth in any one of them because of my role. And therefore, I think I'm a good kind of caricature, I guess, for lack of a better term, of the people that might need to understand it. How can you help me understand the top 3 to 5 things?
Well, I'll say first and foremost, the biggest, let's call it, I'll frame it as a mistake in this case. So the biggest mistake that companies, regardless of their size, can make when they're is just waiting for a detention, waiting for a seizure, waiting for a regulator to question them before they choose to understand their products' value chains, the life cycle of those products from the earth to the finished good. And I think that's a great mistake because, as I alluded to this before, but the nature of compliance itself is changing, compliance with whichever regulation, forced labor, ESG, all these things. And we're moving into this area of component level accountability. So knowing the details behind your product, the input materials and where they came from, how they were made, who touched them and those things. And companies who start thinking about those value chains up front, right? those will be the companies that are ready. Those will be the companies that thrive and comply in this moment and will be ready for whatever regulation comes next beyond forced labor regulation. So I think that's the biggest issue, is just the waiting and seeing. I'll just wait until I'm questioned before I choose to dig deeper. That is just that's the first thing I would tell anybody, is to just start understanding your products, because this is where we live now.
Yeah. So proactive, not reactive. And if I take another cliche, knowledge is power.
All of those cliches are very appropriate here. But proactive versus reactive is definitely something that comes up a lot. But I would say it just a little bit differently. Know your products up front, because the benefits of knowing them up front are going to save you from the reactive scrambling and the costs associated with a detention or with an issue. If you weren't able to import something, it arrives. What are you going to do with it? Is it a lost sale? Does it hold up your production? Is it a customer that's going to be upset? All of those things are bad things. Why not just move that, be proactive, truly be proactive, but be proactive in knowing be proactive in looking into the extended value chains of your products.
And I suppose you can frame this as a positive as well, right? If you understand those things, you might find more innovation or growth opportunities, as well as reduction of harm, you'd assume.
Oh, absolutely. Knowing that information and then being able to take action on it beyond, take compliance off the table, right? Take forced labor and compliance off the table. You can make, if your procurement teams or your finance teams or your marketing teams, sales organizations had that sort of information upstream, you could choose a different supplier before you even sign a contract with them or issue a purchase order to them. You could take care of these things up front to make better choices for your business that will save you in the long run, not to mention keeping you compliant, which is a nice.
Okay. And anything else that you'd suggest that people need to know so they know their products at a component level? Let's assume they've nailed that. They're the best in the world at that. Well, what would the sort of next step be that they should think about as they think about navigating this regulatory landscape and whatever might come next?
Right. So maybe it's the next thing, or maybe it's in addition to how they achieve their understanding of their value chains. But I would say, practically speaking, I would encourage companies, and I do encourage companies, to look beyond traditional trade tools and processes that we've always used to try to comply with various regulations. And I would encourage them to look at modern AI-enabled platforms that connect procurement and compliance and logistics, all these different pieces of data, so you can see these patterns. That's how you see deeper into your value chains. But this is something that we need to encourage more companies to engage in, because the tools that exist, the processes that exist, were not designed for what you and I are talking about today. We're not designed for that product level accountability. So that would be, maybe that should have been step one. Maybe that's what I should have said. But you need to understand your value chain. How you understand your value chains is using these newer, more modern tools, and start looking at those things now.
Yeah. So I suppose you need to decide that you're going to do it, or be aware that you have to do it.
That's
decide
right.
You're going to do it. Decide how you're going to do it, and then you're going to implement it. And I guess that, again, I'm going to use another cliche, right? It's kind of more of a meme, I guess. They say the most dangerous phrase in business is, that's how we've always done it. And anyone that says that maybe they've got some good institutional knowledge, and they can tell you, yeah, this is how we do it. So then you go, right, now what would you change? Has to be the question. Well, let's get into it. So sometimes we say AI, and it can be many things, right? I used to work a lot with supervised learning back in the late 2010s around screening, which is not what most people think of as AI these days, even though machine learning is kind of under that umbrella. And then we had the wave of Gen AI, and now it's LLMs, and there's all these different things. So when we talk about AI uncovering these risks, linking these data, what kind of AI is it? How does it actually work in a way that is different to what we could do before?
Sure. So keep in mind, I'm not an engineer. I'm a trade person, right? So I will answer your question from that perspective. Don't ask me anything super technical. But AI connects the dots. They connect the dots that humans can't connect on their own. They illuminate hidden relationships that get buried deep in our data. Data we already have, but we don't have the capacity to piece it all together to see these things. So this is first and foremost, the great benefit that AI brings to the table. So think about every trade declaration, every shipment record, purchase order, all these different systems that our companies use. They all these little pieces of information, small pieces of the puzzle on their own. They don't reveal much, right? But when AI links billions of those data points together across logistics, across customs, across our company networks, those patterns start to emerge. And so now we can see how our products and the materials and the facilities, how they are connected. And that's how technology like Altana's is able to surface potential forced labor exposures, right? That's how we're able to see these things several tiers upstream that traditional audits or surveys or questionnaires can never touch. They just can't get there. So I think the real power of AI, though, isn't just detecting or uncovering where these risk opportunities reside, but it's using it as foresight. And we talked a bit about being able to take action on this information. So used this way, AI gives companies the context to ask better questions, to validate what's real, to act before that risk turns into a shipment problem or a headline, heaven forbid.
Yeah. I'm not an engineer either, and maybe I'll get some nice angry comments from engineers who'd say you're talking rubbish. I'll check this with some of our data scientists afterwards, but it would sound to me that if you've got all this documentation previously, like what do we have today? We've got all this documentation, we've got these regulations, we've got this database of questionnaires, so you're going to be using some sort of natural language processing technology to read that, understand it, take out the relevant bits. Then you're going to have some models. This is where I'm going to fall down, but which specific type you're going to use, but to then organize that. It's essentially an automation layer. You arguably don't even need AI for it, just need very good rules written and a flow chart essentially of what needs to happen once they've stripped the information. But the interesting bit you then said is the context. So once you've stripped that out and then you've used maybe another type of model, maybe unsupervised learning, maybe some supervised learning, maybe a blend to link it and come up with some scenarios, you need the Gen AI that we've been talking about so much the last few years and the LLMs to then put that back into plain English for your compliance person, trade person, procurement person, and so on, and go, right, you're going to need to go check this. Don't let the AI make the decision, but this is what we think we found. Here's what your policy says you should do. Or we're not sure what the policy says. You need to escalate this and get your senior to kind of come and advise or guide our next steps. And if you can do that, then in moments, right, minutes perhaps, depending on the processing and the compute, versus days or weeks that it maybe would have taken, or not at all because you're just blind to it, then that's got to be a pretty huge transformation.
I think so. And again, I'll say this again. I say this a lot. It's not even forced labor. You could have imagined being able to use the same insight and you have a model that can show you where your forced labor exposure exists, right? On the same value chain information. And then you can have a separate model that shows you, it looks like you might have misdeclared your origin, right? And that could cause you other issues regarding transshipment or getting the tariffs wrong. You could find models or apply models to that data that show you where you have opportunities to save when it comes to tariffs, or it saves other areas. You can have models that can show you where your carbon emissions reside or your risk for deforestation. So all of these things. So all of those different models can be applied to the very same value chain backbone to show you those things, which is really, really powerful.
Bring it back to forced labor. So if you've understood that value chain, you've mapped it, what are the red flags we're looking for to say, because I suppose you can't say purely from that, there's the forced labor, but what we're looking for are flags or indicators. What are those indicators that we would typically flag up in a value chain so someone can ask the next question? Sure.
So a common one might be seeing, I see this supplier out at the tier 2, or this fiber mill or this smelter. Looks like they're actually in Xinjiang, China. And if they're in Xinjiang, China, and my product I'm importing to the United States, that could be problematic. So just the geolocation of where those entities exist.
And that's because Xinjiang is specifically cited in the regulations.
That's right. Yeah. So in the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, it's one of the, they assume guilt until you prove your innocence is if your products were actually manufactured in this region, this very particular region. Other indicators are they owned by an entity that resides in Xinjiang? Are they owned by, or does somebody in their board of directors, or are they their investors, are they tied to forced labor in some way? Are they tied to a particular government entity that is known to subsidize forced labor behavior? So there's several indicators that can tell us whether or not there could be risk that is worthy of investigating.
Okay, so you've got geolocation. And just before I move on from that, is there anywhere other than Xinjiang that people need to look out for?
Sure, forced labor can exist anywhere. There are withhold release orders, at least from the United States standpoint. I'm sure in other countries have their own versions of that that are specific to particular commodities in particular regions. But forced labor, wherever it exists in the world, if it's known to exist, then it could be subject. But there are regions like Xinjiang, China, that are notorious for engaging in forced labor activity. So again, anything manufactured from that region is presumed guilty unless proven otherwise.
Understood. So there's elements that it might be cited by the government in that case. Other times you might need to have trade professionals with an awareness of that and then go around these particular places, whether it's particular mining areas or something else, where you're going to go, that will be an indicator. We need to build that into our risk assessment model. Right. So there's a little bit of work to do rather than just going, what does the regulation say there? And then...
I will say, if I might just interject, though, that those, they change often. New commodities, new regions get added, new manufacturers get identified as known to being engaged in this sort of activity. So doing it manually is certainly an option if companies do want to manually screen their products. But it changes so frequently. And at this day and age, when our supply chains are also changing frequently, using some sort of a model or some sort of automation to identify those things is not only advised, it's actually necessary.
Of course. And again, so you've got the geolocation, you might look at other countries, areas that might be on a list. There might be other lists where people are saying this entity or person is associated, and that's being listed by an authority. I guess the other place would be news, right? When you say if someone associated to something is what's been in the news, and you might not take it as absolute fact, but you would look at it, I presume, as an indicator that would need to be.
Sure, any adverse media that where they show up. I mean, our position is that we'll flag potential indicators, and we don't make the decisions. The decision is up to the companies, but we consume all of those indicators and we just present them.
Of course. And any one company, you said doing something manually is not the most efficient way. So you want to get the data, but any one business, vendor, practitioner can only get so much data. So what's the role for data collaboration in this field? You've got every side of the table, right? You've got your governments, you've got your enforcement agencies, you've got your vendors, you've got the practitioners, you've got trade bodies, etc.
Right.
I'm probably forgetting some. But how do you see that data collaboration world, and is it being used effectively today?
So this is a really exciting area. Is it being used effectively? Well, let's come back to that part. So the truth is no one company or government can solve or see this forced labor risk problem on their own. No one can see all of the supply chain transparency just on their own, right? So each party, the governments, the regulators, the companies themselves, everybody holds this valuable pieces of information, but it lives in these silos, right? It lives in those spreadsheets or separate systems or whatnot in different formats and in different jurisdictions. So what's missing, or what has always been missing, is the ability to connect those insights without exposing sensitive or proprietary information. So sharing only what you want to share with particular entities. And I'm coming back to the collaboration. So that's exactly what data collaboration makes possible. So each party can contribute what they know in a secure and safe way so that together they can see the full picture. Now, at Altana, we enable that collaboration through what we call product passports, digital containers that companies can package up all of we say, show your homework. So, we've looked at our value chain, everything looks good, everything's clean, let's package this up into a product passport and then use that to share with a regulator to prove that, hey, everything looks good from our side. Do you have any questions? And maybe we can eliminate the potential for detention or whatnot. Now, take the regulator out of the question. What if you do see something risky and you want to share and take that snapshot of your value chain and say, I want to go collaborate with that supplier and work with them to mitigate the issue. Now you can in almost I use the Google Docs sort of analogy where I can tag at supplier, this looks odd. Can you tell me more about this supplier? Or does this supplier's products actually make its way back into the manufacturer of my products? And they can reply back and you can capture all that information. Now you've collaborated to flesh out what you see. And then you could even share that with the regulator to further prove that you've done your homework to make sure that your chains are free from forced labor or other non-compliance. So this is where we see the next generation of trusted trade programs moving to, but it relies on having that, being able to collaborate to understand and engage in what you see. Just using AI to illuminate your value chains and using that on face value, I don't think is enough. You need to use those models to indicate where there could be risk, engage with your chains to validate, negate, or validate that risk exists, and then fix it. Yeah. And then you can engage with the regulators.
I'm probably going to annoy the technologists or the proper engineers again. It's not the same. There's some similarities with how people explain blockchains. Of like, okay, well, if you have the transparency to the level that people are comfortable and need it, and then you can then go and collaborate on something, or you can investigate what's actually under that, or the transaction history or the risk mitigation history, then that can create trust even between parties that maybe don't know each other if they can see the work or see the homework. So yeah, again, I've annoyed someone somewhere, but to me, that's how I'm sort of translating. Oh, that sounds kind of similar. We've done a lot of episodes on crypto and the pros, the cons, the risks, the rewards. And yeah, it seems like the product passport could almost be a quasi version of that, bringing transparency.
That's the idea, right? Yeah. But again, it's sharing what you want to share. It's not sharing anything proprietary or sensitive. It's having control over what you share, but exercising those insights in a way where everybody's working together off of the same information to achieve their respective goals.
Got it. And I know for a fact, because I'm involved, Altana and Moody's do this data collaboration particularly well. What is it that you think Altana and Moody's are doing together that they couldn't do on their own?
So Altana, our bread and butter, our core asset is the product network. We've built the world's first product network that shows us the life cycle of all these products. We've taken all this data together, we've stitched it together. We can now see the movements of all of our products around the world, all the way back to the earth, right? That's pretty powerful and that's amazing. The partnership with Moody's is augmenting that information now with ownership information. Who owns these entities? Where do these entities exist? Where do they reside? Where do they do business? So together, we're more powerful than on our own. The information on it, the Moody's information on its own, the ownership information, again, interesting, insightful, important. But if you can't link those ownerships together and see how these different companies are working together, it would take a lot of work for somebody to, a lot of different acrobatics to make that data work for a particular company, especially to achieve a goal like forced labor compliance.
So I suppose if Altana's mapped the flow and then Moody's mapped the control, who's controlling that flow, and then you bring the two together, you mentioned earlier, like, is a director involved? Is a shareholder involved? Is a company have an affiliate over there that they might be I can't say the word, hiding something.
Right. Obfuscate.
Yeah, there, thank you. Thank you. I've blown my voice today. But then, yeah, I say, I've been working on it this year a little bit. The people who've gone before me that have done all the legwork, to be fair. But it's very interesting how that data collaboration can create something better than the sum of its parts for particular use cases. And as we said at the top of the show, forced labor, potentially the most horrific risk, potentially, that I think it is, that we help companies manage and mitigate and try to resolve. We don't presume that we're stopping it on our own. There's obviously the enforcement agencies and the law enforcement, various bodies that are front line doing the work. But however we can help, right? That's the role, and that data coming together seems very powerful in that fight. Yeah. Let's go back to some case studies. Is there, as you say, companies are using the Altana network and the graph there to understand where their forced labor risk is. Can you sort of think of some lessons learned recently from sort of engagements in that area, and anything you'd, perhaps I don't like the word best practice particularly, or the phrase, but let's use it. Any best practices you'd say from these engagements that you'd hope other listeners in this audience would think about applying themselves?
Yeah, so I've got a couple case studies come to mind, and I'll give you the punchline up front since you asked for the best practice up front. Yeah. I think the best practice you can learn from both of these is get ahead of understanding your value chains before something bad happens. So in both of the use cases that I'll share with you, these companies, something bad happened at the border, they got a detention or they got an inquiry, something that caused their shipments to stop. They had to stop, scramble, and then they decided to invest in illuminating their value chain, which is great because they came out better on the other end. But the lesson to be learned here is to get ahead of it, which is what we said earlier. So a couple examples. So one very large chemical manufacturer, they are a CTPAT, trusted trader importer. So in the United States, CTPAT is the Customs and Trade Partnership Against Terrorism. Basically, if you get validated as a CTPAT importer, you're considered very trusted. Okay. All right. So here's this chemical manufacturer. They're very trusted. And one of their shipments of a very key ingredient, a key product that they sell on to other customers, was detained for purposes related to the UFLPA. And it was detained for 6 months while they collected the documentation and while Customs did their investigation, right? And the shipment ended up getting denied entry. It cost this company $2 million. So that's 6 months delay plus costing them $2 million. And that's in lost sales plus legal fees and the resources to collect all the data.
Not to mention probably downstream impact on customers, other parts of the value chain that are frustrated.
Right. Yeah. Yes. So while the interesting about this particular case is they could see what their competitors kept sourcing from the same supplier, the same product from the same supplier, without having any issue at all. So this case revealed something really interesting to us is that the companies that are trying the hardest to be compliant happen to be the ones that are getting penalized. So that didn't sit very well with them. So to avoid future problems, particularly with this one product, but then it has grown to other products since then, is they flipped the script. So they were using Altana already. So they used Altana's product network to map the value chain for this particular product. They created a product passport, as I mentioned earlier, and they proactively shared that passport with CBP before they had a shipment of before the next shipment of this product left origin. They proved to Customs that they had done their homework. They collaborated directly with the regulators, and then they ultimately did avoid a future detention on that second shipment. They restored the relationship with the supplier, who was quite frustrated because they weren't having issues with other customers, right? And they neutralized the competitive disadvantage that had put them in. So imagine if they had mapped or illuminated their value chains first, and if they had proactively shared that information up front.
Yeah.
They would have avoided the $2 million plus the 6 months and all of this struggle. A similar case that I'll share, where it's the same basic lesson learned, slightly different situation, is there's this iconic American apparel manufacturer. They were known for quality products. They're known to be a very ethical company. And they had 47 consecutive shipments of the same product from the same supplier get detained for reasons related to forced labor. And the funny thing is that every single one of those got released, no problem, but only after months and millions of dollars of sharing documentation and going through all these motions to get these things released. So they too went through the same process, used Altana's product network, illuminated their value chains for this particular product, shared it with Customs in advance to say, hey, look, we can see everything. Everything's fine. Here's all the documentation. Customs was able to engage with them, say, no, we kind of see something over here. Can you respond to this or can you answer a couple of questions? They did that. The 48th shipment did not get detained when it arrived in the US. No delay, no detention, no additional bills. So the lesson in both of those cases is that transparency not only works best when shared, but had they done all that work earlier, they wouldn't have had to scramble after the fact in order to satisfy not only the detention, but to try to avoid future ones. So
that's really interesting because it reminds me of a conversation I had about regulators, vendors, practitioners, and sort of who's ahead. It was on a podcast with Supply Chain Now, and we were talking about KYC and supply chain and lessons that can go back and forth. But often the regulator might have lots of plans, things they want to do, but it takes a while for legislation to go through and stuff to come in. So they almost are always ending up trying to raise the floor rather than set the ceiling in terms of the standards. And practitioners, as we said, sometimes aren't going to be maybe funded even or have the political buy-in at their companies to do more than they're being asked to do. Whereas vendors often trying to innovate, particularly in the risk space, you're trying to look for things that nobody else can see as to find a competitive advantage. So in this case, packaging stuff up in advance from the value chain and doing that would put you ahead of these risks rather than responding to them, proactive rather than reactive. Similarly, in KYC on that other conversation, it's like, why wouldn't you go looking for signals of financial crime rather than waiting for it to happen?
Right.
So that you don't have to deal with the investigation later. I appreciate it's a trade-off, right? Because it's how much resource do you have and what can you do and can you get buy-in? But it just reminds me that story of if you can do it up front, then you are ahead of the regulator, the enforcement agency, and you can kind of almost put them in your rearview mirror. Pay attention, but trust that you, by doing everything you can, are likely to comply with the spirit of the regulation anyway.
That's right. I if you can, yes, but I think it's even more than if you can. I think this is where we're going. This is where compliance in general is going. Trade compliance is going. So if you want to engage in cross-border activity, then this is our, I hate the term new normal, but this is our normal now.
Yeah.
Right? We can't afford to be reactionary with whatever it is, forced labor, any of those other types of regulations I mentioned earlier, particularly with the volatility we're experiencing with tariffs, right? As tariffs continue to change and having to know where your products are coming from, how do you really know?
No, it's absolutely right. And it's interesting, as we've gone through this conversation, we've obviously talked about forced labor, but it seems it's the same solution to a number of risks. You mentioned tariffs, mentioned some other things, and something that it was suggested I ask was like, what's the next thing? What's the future, right, on ethical sourcing, particularly with regards to forced labor? But it kind of sounds like it's not really about this next thing. It's actually the current thing needs to be done still, because it sounds like there's still a lot of people that don't know their value chain.
Right. So it's not what is the next thing, it's how do we prepare ourselves for the next thing. And I would respond to that by saying, for as long as any of us can remember in our professional lives or careers, companies only had to prove compliance after the fact. That's just the nature of compliance. When something went wrong, when a regulator came knocking and asking questions, we never considered proving it in advance because we didn't have to. So that is what's changing. That is what's next. That is what I mean by now we're in this era of component level accountability, where companies are having to use AI to share data to learn more about their product value chains earlier and engage those regulators before these problems happen. So this shift where we are, it changes the entire rhythm of compliance with all the different regulations, trade, labor, what have you. So instead of reacting, companies are now in a position where they should be submitting that verified information up front. So on top of that, I would also say that the same visibility that we've been talking about today that satisfies the regulators also empowers businesses, as you mentioned earlier, to influence better decision-making. Because once our companies have that product level traceability, they can model tariffs, they can measure their carbon, they can protect their brand integrity, and even collaborate with their suppliers on improvements. So as far as what's next, I think this is what's next. This is our new mode of operation. So I don't think, it's not that transparency is new. It's what we're doing with it.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think, again, I'm reflecting on the previous episodes we've done on forced labor and modern slavery and human trafficking over the last 4 or 5 years of this podcast. And even if I was to map those episodes, I think the first time we did it in 22, it was like, let's create awareness. We talked about awareness. And Then we've kind of talked at different points about sort of impact it has on real people that are being victimized here or being trafficked, etc. I know some people don't like the victimized word. And then more recently, we've been talking about, okay, so what do you do? And today it feels like we're very much talking about execution. Is, okay, everyone's aware of the problem, or most people are. There is now regulation in place to bring up the floor of what you're supposed to do. There is also those who are trying to do as much as possible and get ahead of the problem, as we've discussed. So now really the challenge to our audience, look at that on the camera here, is what you're going to do about it. Do you want to talk to Amy, talk to there are other companies that do or try to do similar things, but mapping that value chain, that component level accountability, I think was the phrase you used, making sure you've understood the augmentation of that data for the various ways that people might hide and the risk indicators. And if you're doing all that, then it's very unlikely that you're going to be caught out by regulation because you are doing everything available within the toolkits out there. So maybe next year when we're talking about this in the Human Trafficking Awareness Month, we can talk about some success stories, I hope. Maybe some human trafficking rings or forced labour camps have been broken up even. Maybe we'll find someone on the enforcement side. We still like to do recommended resources because for some folks, they're going to listen to this, have enjoyed it, hopefully been informed, but they'll want to know more. So where would you send them if they want to learn more about this topic, more about value chain visibility and Altana?
Right. So I would say altana.ai, altana.ai. We have just a constant refresh of new case studies where our solutions have helped companies to achieve goals similar to forced labor, things like we've been talking about. LinkedIn is a great way. If you follow me, I'm constantly posting new information and updates on success stories or new innovative ways to achieve these compliance goals. That's what I would recommend.
Fantastic. Well, we'll get your LinkedIn profile linked. We'll get the website linked and a couple of case studies as well. And then, I've already said thank you to you, but I'll say it again. I'll say thank you to Mark for all the work on the podcast and to the marketing team for putting this conversation together. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And thanks for having me. And thank you for the partnership that we've had. We wouldn't be here if it weren't for this relationship. So thank you so much.